Okay, welcome back. So today we're doing May-June 2021, question paper 13. So question 4, functions of money is no longer on the syllabus for AS level. So we'll mark that question off. Money is now moved to A level. So we start at question 30. Okay, graph shows inflation rates over 4 years for selected emerging economies. Government central banks set target minimum inflation rates before readjusting interest rates to stabilize economy. Minimum inflation rate target set was 4%. At which points will they allow interest rates to fall? Okay, so if you've been doing any reading about the current US economy and the Fed with the interest rates, what you'll see is that, so it depends on the inflation, right? Now, for them to have the interest rates to fall, that means they need to stimulate the economy to bring back up towards the target level of inflation. So basically, any time the interest rates are above 4% here, which would be X or would be W, what they will do in those circumstances is they will increase the interest rates to move aggregate demand to the left, and therefore to reduce the level of inflation back towards this target of 4% that they have. So anytime the interest rates are below that, which in this case would be at Y and Z, that's when they would actually decrease the interest rates because they're trying to move aggregate demand to the right, and they're trying to stimulate growth, which will allow them to move back up towards their target rate of 4%. So really the theory is very simple. The rate of inflation is below their target, they reduce the interest rates to stimulate consumption and investment, and the inflation rate is above 4%, they increase the interest rate to reduce aggregate demand and to bring it back towards the rate of inflation that is their target. Okay, 29. Deflation is associated with persistent falling price levels. Which government policy would be most effective to prevent deflation? Okay, so again, remember, we're trying to do the same thing here. Deflation, we'll assume that it's bad deflation, which means that aggregate demand has moved to the left and real GDP has fallen. So in order to fix that, we need to move AD to the right. So improving or imposing maximum price on basic foodstuffs, that is definitely not going to help us to move aggregate demand to the right. It's going to create a shortage in basic foodstuffs. Improving consumer confidence by reducing sales tax. Okay, so while that could actually increase consumer expenditure, it's unlikely to have an effect on the whole economy. Increasing income taxes definitely won't, because that's a contractionary policy, so it will create further deflation by moving AD further to the left. So what we're left with is removing economic uncertainty and encouraging business investment. That will increase the I component, the investment component of aggregate demand, and that will definitely result in aggregate demand moving to the right, which will allow us to increase the price level and stop the deflation that has been happening. Question 28. Which combination identifies a main aim of supply side policy and a measure used to achieve the target? Okay, so first of all, this should be very easy to identify, because while the other ones could be true, so increasing the money supply to get to full employment could be true, it is not a supply side policy, it is a monetary policy. More progressive taxation is a fiscal policy, and while it can be used to reduce income inequality or to create more income equality, again, it's not a supply side policy. And the same thing with decreasing interest rates. First of all, decreasing interest rates does not result in stable prices. It's a monetary policy again, but it's expansionary, so it actually will increase the price level. Deregulation, so removing the restrictions on industries, in terms of the rules and regulations that they have to operate with. That is a supply side policy making us more efficient. It should allow us to generate economic growth because it should allow us, as is the aims of supply side policy, through increased efficiency to be able to move aggregate supply to the right. Okay, 27. Which type of policy would have the most immediate effect in dealing with a deflationary economic downturn? Okay, so the same thing here. Deflationary economic downturn, we are looking to move aggregate demand to the right in order to deal with the deflationary downturn that has happened. So increasing government budget surplus, that would definitely not work, because that would result in government revenue rising and government expenditure going down, which would tell us that they're using contractionary fiscal policy, increasing taxes and decreasing government spending, and that would move aggregate demand to the left, not to the right. So that would be the opposite of the policy we'd be trying to follow. Increasing borrowing by assisting banks to lend more, that definitely would result in AD moving right. It would increase consumption and increase investment by making it easier for people to borrow money. Investing in long-term projects to improve transfer networks, that would, however, even though it would shift aggregate supply to the right, and therefore it may help us to deal with a deflationary economic downturn, remember that when aggregate supply moves to the right, what it can do is it can actually result in the price level dropping as well, and that is not the aim that we want, because we're told it's deflationary. Also, on the other hand, it takes a very long time for supply side policies to take effect, so it would not be an immediate effect. And finally, switching the burden of taxation from earning to spending, that would be the same thing. It's like switching direct taxes to indirect taxes. In other words, it's still restricting our ability to spend, so it will not allow us to increase our consumption or increase our investment. It's basically just switching from direct to indirect taxes. It would have the same effect. Consumption and investment would be unaffected or possibly negatively affected, which would continue to have aggregate demand spiraling to the left and continue with the deflationary economic downturn. Question 26. Which statement about trade protection is correct? Tariff results in a greater decrease in demand for an import. The lower is its price elasticity of demand. That is false. Tariff results in a greater decrease in demand the higher its PED, because the higher its PED, the greater the percentage change in quantity demanded will be. Embargoes are only an effective trade barrier when the demand for imports is price elastic. That's also false. Embargoes are a ban, so therefore the PED or the demand for imports doesn't matter if it's price elastic or price inelastic, because we've completely banned them from being able to come into the economy. Export subsidies to domestic firms will prevent the dumping of foreign products. Again, that is not true. Although it can happen, if export subsidies are provided to domestic firms and the price that the domestic firms are selling at is still below, it's not going to affect their price competitiveness. But also, if we want to protect or prevent the dumping of foreign products, we need to actually implement anti-dumping measures. So us being able to sell our products at a lower price does not stop the ability of the foreign firms to be able to dump their products into our country. So we need to actually develop either anti-dumping tariffs or place some form of embargo on the dumping that's occurring. We need to directly address the dumping. So what we're left with is quotas are less effective than tariffs for raising government revenue. That is true. Tariffs allow the government to collect tax revenue, quotas do not. Remember, quotas are just a limit that is placed on the level of imports, whereas tariffs are directly taxes that are placed on the imports. So they would be more effective at raising revenue. Okay, a country has a balance of trade deficit for 25. What would be least likely to be improved as a result of a depreciation of its currency? Okay, if remember, first of all, depreciation results in price of exports down, total exports to go up, price of imports up, total imports to go down. So we've got a balance of trade deficit, so this is what we want. We want our exports to rise to reduce the deficit. But if a country is operating with a significant amount of unused resources, we have a lot of spare capacity, and then the depreciation is unlikely to have a significant effect because we're still going to try and address the levels of capacity, and it's going to take a long time in order to do so. If the sum of the price elasticities of demand for exports and imports is less than 1, okay, that would help us out, or be least likely, because what's going to happen in that case is if it's less than 1, exports won't actually rise, exports will go down, and imports will go up, and that is not going to help us increase it's not going to help us to increase or to improve the deficit. It will help us to improve the deficit if the PED values are greater than 1. And just for point A as well, while A can actually help us to increase the deficit, it will take a longer time than if we had less resources available, but it will still be effective because it will allow us to move AD to the right, and it will allow us to move real GDP up, which will help us to reduce the deficit. It might just take a longer time than if, for example, we were able to increase AS as well and to increase our capacity. In the long term, price elasticity of demand for export should increase. No, because that will help us again if we said PED for exports is high. And if a country uses a relatively small proportion of imports in their production process, that will help us as well, because the higher prices for the imports will be less affected if we have only a small proportion of imports that we have to import for raw materials. Question 24. The world trade price of cars in country Y is US $10,000. At this price, domestic car producers supply 100,000 cars, domestic consumers purchase 200,000 cars. Okay. Government of country Y imposes a 10% tariff. Under which conditions will the tariff raise the most revenue for the government? Okay. So, domestic consumers are purchasing 200,000 a year. Domestic producers are supplying 100,000. So what we want is, because the tariff will increase the price on the imported cars, we are going to want the PED for demand for cars in the country to be inelastic, because we don't want the higher price to affect their ability to pay. In other words, we still want the imports to be price competitive, or to be competitive against domestic producers. The more inelastic the value is, the more competitive they will be. At the same time, we're going to want the price elasticity of supply of the domestic producers to be low, because we don't want them to be able to quickly respond to the changes in the price, and that way, again, we'll still have more imports than we would if they were elastic and quickly able to release their supply to the market. So that would result in the government being able to obtain the most revenue. 23. What may increase the benefits that a country gains from international trade? Okay, this should be very straightforward. A reduction in transport costs because of a fall in world oil prices, that definitely will, because it will make international trade easier with reducing our cost of production. Domestic wage rates increase at a faster rate than the output per worker, definitely not, because our cost of production will increase in that case, which is not going to benefit international trade as our products become less price competitive. Domestic labour force becomes more occupationally immobile, definitely not as well. It will restrict their ability to move between industries. And trading partners increase tariffs. Same thing. That's going to make it's going to make our exports less price competitive. So it's definitely not going to allow us to benefit from international trade. Question 22. A sudden rise in the price of imported oil caused the annual rate of inflation in a given period to be higher than expected. What might be a likely result of this? Okay, so we're importing the oil, annual rate of inflation is higher than expected. What we'd expect is that we have cost push inflation here, right? So we'd expect that AS would move left and we would generate cost push inflation. Now, if you remember, with cost push inflation, that means that real GDP will move to the left or decrease, and therefore unemployment would not fall, unemployment would actually rise. Balance of trade would not improve, the balance of trade would decrease. Real wages would also not rise, real wages would fall when we have inflation. Borrowers would gain, that absolutely would be the case. If they're able to borrow at a fixed rate of interest, they would be able to gain as a result of the inflation that happens. Okay, 21. A country with a fixed exchange rate experiences a higher rate of inflation than its trading partners. What is the likely effect? Okay, very simple. If we experience a higher rate of inflation, then what happens is that our exports, which are now more expensive to make in the domestic economy, will drop. Because we have a higher rate of inflation compared to our trading partners, that makes importing from those partners more price competitive, which means that our imports should rise and our exports should drop, and that will give us B. Question 20. What is not an aim of protectionism? Okay, so to improve the balance of trade, that could be an aim of protectionism. To increase the price of exports, that's definitely not an aim of protectionism. Remember that one of the aims or one of the tools of protectionism is to provide export subsidies. We're trying to help out exporters and domestic companies, right? So we want their prices to be lower to make them more price competitive for international trade. We also use it to protect infant industries, aka sunrise industries, industries we feel will be important in the future, and we also use them to reduce the volume of imports through, for example, a quota or an embargo, which would be a limit in the quotas case on the number of imports that can come into the country. What would be certain to cause a fall in a country's cost of living? Okay, a fall in real incomes, cost of living, not necessarily. Fall in the inflation rate, again, not necessarily. A deflation, which is a negative inflation rate, that definitely would, because remember the cost of living is associated with the purchasing power, right? So what we're looking for is we're looking for the purchasing power to drop. Purchasing power to rise, and the only reason the purchasing power would rise would be if we have deflation. So when the purchasing power rises, that results in the cost of living, because we are able to purchase more goods and services with the same value of money, that allows us to live cheaper than we were previously, and therefore reducing direct tax rates will also not have an effect. We're looking for deflation. B still means we have inflation if there's a fall in the rate. So therefore the only correct or logical answer would be C. Okay, we're looking for transfer payments. Remember, they're non-productive forms of payments. They're paid to vulnerable members of society. Pensions for elderly people is a transfer payment. Welfare payments to sick people is a transfer payment. Spending on hospitals could be current or capital spending by the government. It is not a transfer payment. Payment to unemployed workers, that is a transfer payment. Defence spending, again, could be capital or current spending. And teachers' salaries would be current spending. They're not transfer payments. Remember, there's three types of government spending. There's the non-exhaustive forms, which are transfer payments, and there is the exhaustive forms of government spending, which are current and capital spending. Capital is the spending on building infrastructure. Current spending is the spending on keeping those goods and those services running. Okay, government decides to build additional public sector housing to be rented to people receiving low incomes. What is most likely to fall as a result of the increase in public sector housing? Okay, employment in the construction industry is definitely not going to fall. It's going to rise, right? Because we are building more houses. So very simply, we're going to need more construction workers to do so. Land prices in towns and cities will rise as well. Because we are now going to have a higher demand for housing. So we would expect that the land prices in the towns and the cities will rise. In addition to that, you want to think about the level of land that would be available. We would be using up land to build additional public sector housing, which would provide less land to be built for private sector housing. And therefore, if we can build less, then the supply of private sector housing, for example, could be affected. Total government spending will definitely not fall. It will rise again, because we've just been told the government is spending on building public sector housing. The rents of the houses in the private sector, they will fall. And that's because what will people do? They will move to rent from houses in the public sector instead, which will decrease the demand for houses in the private sector to be rented, not necessarily to buy though. Okay, question 16. Diagram represents original demand curve D1 and original supply S1 for electric cars. Government decides to provide a subsidy to electric car manufacturers. What area represents total revenue of the car manufacturer after receiving the subsidy from the government? Okay, so first thing to recognize, the total revenue will be everything that's spent on it, right? So the total revenue of the car manufacturer will include the size of the subsidy that has been granted by the government. So therefore, if we can show you first the size of the subsidy, like we've shown you in many of these past papers before, is calculated from the new supply up to where we hit the original and straight across. So the size of the subsidy would be E, G, or N. Right, that is essentially the revenue they're receiving through the subsidy, but they're also still selling these goods here. So OYGN would still be revenue that they're generating, right? It would now just be split between the revenue portion from the subsidy and the revenue from the just general expenditure on the good or the service. So the total revenue of the car manufacturer, the main thing to take into account there is that it's going to have to be added to the area of the subsidy, because the subsidy is essentially revenue that they are getting as well. So that will leave us therefore with O, E, or Y, and we can see that that would be A. Question 15. Provision of rail services is switched from private sector to public sector. What is necessarily correct? Okay, so it's gone from private to public, Average fare charge for the service will fall. That is not necessarily true. They could still rise. It's likely to fall, absolutely, when it moves to the public sector. But it doesn't necessarily have to fall, because the private sector might have been more efficient in their provision of rail services, which might have allowed them to actually operate with economies of scale and therefore a lower price. When it moves into the hand of the public sector, it might become more inefficient, and therefore we may not be able to charge a lower price, because we may not be as efficient with managing our cost of production. Profitability of the service will fall as well is also not necessarily true. Could happen or couldn't happen. It depends on how the private sector runs it. Rail services management were responsible to different owners. Well, that is definitely going to be true, right? Because they're now responsible to the government instead of the private sector firm and their shareholders, who they would have previously been responsible to. And there will be an increase in the number of workers employed. Again, we know that in theory, when you move from private to public sector, there is an increase in number of workers employed, but we can't necessarily say it's correct, because there may be a decrease in the number of workers employed. We don't know how the public sector is going to manage the provision of those rail services. So we have to pick the one that is 100% going to be correct and is not subject to any possible changes, which the others are. Question 14. In many countries there are goods that must be directly provided by the government. Okay, very simple. We are talking here about public goods, which will be non-excludable and non-rivalrous. What would be the most convincing argument for such provision? We can see it in D, non-rivalrous and non-excludable, which means the private sector cannot charge a price for them, which means the public sector has to provide them. Okay, so A, that's talking about a merit good, B, that's talking about a demerit good, and C, have high opportunity costs, has no reason for providing a convincing argument for providing public goods. That would actually be a reason why we shouldn't provide public goods, not a convincing argument to provide them. Okay, table gives information about the market for two models of car. Prices of the car remain unchanged, but the price of petrol increases by 100%. What will be the effect on the number of cars sold per week? So we're told this is their cross elasticity in relation to petrol. Remember, the formula for cross elasticity is the percentage change in QD of A, or product A, divided by the percentage change in price of product B. So in this case, we know the price is going up by 100%. So because we've got a negative elasticity here, it tells us that they're complements, right? So that means that the demand would have to change in the opposite direction. So demand would have to drop for the number of cars sold each week for both of these. Drop by 25% for the 1200cc and drop by 50% for the 2000cc. Okay. Very simple. That would therefore be 25% of 10,000 is 2,500, and 50% of 5,000 is also 2,500. They would both drop, so they would decrease by 5,000. Okay. Diagram shows the outcome when a landowner who had allowed motorists to park on his field at no cost introduces a parking charge of $1. What would happen as a result of this change? Okay, very simply, before, when he was allowing people to park in it for free, that means that there would be no price charged, right? So if I just take this out for a sec, before he charges a price, that means that both X and Y would have been the consumer surplus, because there can be no producer surplus when there is no price charged for the product, because there is no benefit to the consumer in that case. So once he charges $1 for the product, then what happens is that this area in here, Y, now matches up with what we know would be deemed to be a producer surplus, which would be the area below the equilibrium price to the bottom of the supply curve. So as soon as he charges a price for it, it creates a producer surplus because he would be willing to charge it at a lower price. So therefore, the ownership of surplus Y will change. So it changes from previously being a consumer surplus to now being a producer surplus once there's a price charged for the product. Okay, question 11. A country's central bank has commissioned a report on the demand for and price of houses. What might be the most likely combination of reasons for an increase in the price and the quantity demanded of houses? Okay, increase in the price and the quantity. So very simple, when we think about our incomes will have to rise, right? Because incomes rising will make the demand for houses rise. Because it will also make it easier for people to borrow money too, right? Because they're restricted in terms of what percentage of their salary they can obtain as a mortgage. If the interest rates go down, that will encourage consumption and investment, and it will encourage people to borrow money for a house. And if the wages of bricklayers remain unchanged, then again the prices are unlikely to be affected, but also the cost of production in terms of producing the houses will remain the same. So it's unlikely to have a dramatic increase in the price of the houses, which may restrict the demand more than if the price just increases by a little bit because of the demand from the lower interest rates and the demand from the higher incomes. Okay, remember that if the wages of bricklayers go up, what would it do? It would increase the price and the quantity of demanded of houses up further, because it would increase the price of those houses as the cost of production goes up. But that would not result in the quantity demanded of houses rising if the increase in that price is too high. But as long as the cost of production for the houses stay the same, and it becomes easier to borrow money and we have more money through higher incomes, then it would result in increase in price and the quantity demanded for the houses would rise as well. Okay, a UK-based food company wishes to diversify its product range. To obtain this, it has obtained a $10 million loan from a bank to buy land, build and equip a bakery. What would not be classified as a factor of production? Okay. So again, if you read over your factor of production section, this should be very straightforward. Money is not a factor of production. So the loan that's used to finance the product is not. Land is obviously a factor of production. Capital and ovens and soya would be part of either the labor or the capital that is needed to do it, right? So to equip the bakery, we need ovens, and then soya is an ingredient that we need to make the bread. They obviously would be part of the factor of production in a bakery. So money is not part of the factors of production. Okay, we're given a demand and supply diagram for diesel cars in Europe. Successful advertising campaign by electric car producers. We're looking at the demand and supply for diesel cars, remember. So when there's a successful advertising campaign, that will move the demand to the right. But in this case, it's a successful advertising campaign by a substitute, which means that the demand will move left for us. They're now more popular, we're now less popular. So we move on to this point here. And we've got a new unit tax, which will shift our supply curve to the left. And so we'll end at point D. Okay, question 8. Car manufacturer estimates that the PES of its cars is plus 2.5. What will be the impact of a 10% increase in price? So remember the formula. PES is the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. If it's 2.5, then it's essentially x over 10 equals 2.5, which tells us that that quantity supplied has to be a 25% increase. Okay, a product has a low PES. What might explain this? If the product is highly perishable, that does result in having a low PES. Remember, determinants of PES are the ability to store, the level of spare capacity that they have. Has nothing to do with opportunity cost. Has nothing to do with whether it's an inferior good, etc. That's YED that calculates that. And the product considered to be a necessity, that is a determinant of PED, not a determinant of PES. What will not cause a shift in the market supply curve of a commodity? A change in technology will, either right or left. Rise in the price of a factor input will, it will shift it to the left. Rise in the price will not. Remember that these factors here, so A, B, and D, they will all shift the supply curve, but the one thing that does not shift the supply curve is a rise in the price or a change in the price of the product itself. A change in the price of the product itself will cause an extension or a contraction in the supply curve, not a shift. Okay, ceteris paribus question. When stating the law of demand, economists use the phrase all other things being equal, ceteris paribus. What is not one of those other things? Ceteris paribus assumes the price of the good can change, but all of the other factors affecting the demand and supply for that good are remaining constant during that time. So income of consumer, price of other goods, and tastes of the consumer, they would all be assumed to remain constant at the time that we're drawing the diagram. So again, to recap on that, you just need to go look at ceteris paribus. It's in one of your first chapters there, and generally it assumes that only the price of the product is changing when we're drawing the demand and supply curves. Okay, what do economists regard as the reward for taking risks and organizing production? So this is essentially what is the reward or the payment to the factor of production for enterprise, right? So the payment to the factor of production for enterprise is profit. Now remember, for the other factors of production, the payment for land is rent, the payment for capital is interest, and the payment for labor is wages. So the reward therefore is profit, because that we're told for taking risks and organizing production, that tells us that they're talking about the factor of production enterprise. Okay, which is a normative statement? So subjective. China has never had a balance of payments surplus. That would be a positive statement, right? Factual or could be tested. Higher interest rates might reduce investment. Again, we can test that statement, right? So it would make it positive. Perfect competition is allocatively efficient. Again, it's a positive statement. It's a hypothesis that can be tested. Welfare payments should be increased is an opinion or a subjective statement that cannot be tested. So therefore it would be a normative statement. Okay, and government provides milk at no charge to very low income families. Now this is a very common question. They always try and trick you out, right? Remember, there's actually very few public goods, right? And in order to be a public good, it has to be non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Now milk is definitely not non-rivalrous, right? Providing milk at no charge to very low income families might make it non-excludable for them, but it's definitely not non-rivalrous, because as soon as you drink from a carton of milk, there's less milk available for others to consume. So it is rivalrous in consumption, which means that it has to be a private good and not a public good. It's not an inferior good because milk is not low quality, and it is not a free good because it needs factors of production in order to make it, and it does have an opportunity cost. Okay, that's it for this paper.